Hi everyone, so in this video we're going to see about banking. So in the very first unit we're going to see about the history of banking. So there are various stages of history of banking. So first we will go to the empire stage. So yearly Raja Galathukku povum. So during the ages or ancient times where kings ruled us. So we just had barter systems. So in ancient world it was like exchange of goods against goods. So there were no rule for coins, and then came coins. Coins were introduced. It was introduced in various metals, and it was basically used for trading for foreign goods. So when there is an introduction of coins, then came banks. So banks basically the first, it wasn't a separate building. Okay, temples acted as banks. So we had coins to be kept safely. So for which temples were used as banks. Temples were the place of custodian of coins, and it also loaned money to the people. So the first bank in the world, it was built in Rome in the year 210 BC. So this first bank was a separate building for bank, and so this is something very important. And in Middle Ages we had various other banks like Banco di Rialto, Banco del Virgo, Bank of Amsterdam, Bank of England were other oldest banks that evolved during years. And what is the meaning of the word bank? So it is basically an Italian word which means bench. So it is derived from the Italian word banco, which means bench. So this is that bench. So these benches in Italian streets were used for money exchanges, to exchange their money, to exchange their currency, and that is where from we got this word bank, from the Italian word banco, which means bench. So this is with regard to the history of banking. So first we didn't had any coins, we just had barter system. Then we had introduction of coins in various metals, which is basically used for trading of foreign goods. And temples in ancient times were acted as banks. They basically perform two functions. One is the custody of coins, and the other one they loaned money. So when did a separate building for bank was established? It was in the year 210 BC. It was in Rome city. Okay. So and we had various other banks that emerged, that was established in Middle Ages. Banco di Rialto, Banco del Virgo, Bank of Amsterdam, and Bank of England. And then we also saw the origin of the word bank. It is basically an Italian word banco, which means bench. So now moving on to the Indian banking system. We now know Indian banking structure has RBI as the head of the institution, and we have various commercial banks and cooperative banks under RBI. Under commercial banks we have public sector banks and private sector banks, and under public sector banks we have SBI and nationalized banks. So this is the present banking structure in India. What about the history of banking structure in India? So we have three phases of development when it comes to Indian banking structure. So these three phases are phase 1, phase 2 and phase 3. Phase 1 is between the years 1770 to 1969. Phase 2 is between the years 1969 to 1991. And phase 3 is from 1991. So moving on to the early phase, what actually happened in the early phase of Indian banking? So in India, the bank originated in 18th century. The first bank that was established in India is Bank of Hindustan in the year 1779, and then it was General Bank of India 1786. But these banks were failed and it got liquidated, it got shut down. So what is that oldest bank that was formed or that was established long years back and still in existence? It's State Bank of India. So State Bank of India is the oldest and largest bank still in existence. So now let's look into the history of State Bank of India. Moving on to the year 1806. So in 1806, a bank called Bank of Calcutta was originated, and in 1809, the same Bank of Calcutta was renamed as Bank of Bengal, And in 1921, this Bank of Bengal, along with Bank of Bombay and Bank of Madras, were merged to form Imperial Bank. And in 1995, this Imperial Bank was renamed as State Bank of India. And that is how the State Bank of India, which was the earlier Bank of Calcutta and Bank of Bengal and Imperial Bank, is now the State Bank of India, is the largest and oldest bank in existence. And within this time period, in phase 1, we had this Banking Regulation Act 1949, which was enacted, and only in this time period we had the Central Bank of India, which is the Reserve Bank of India, was established in the year 1935 as per the Act 1934. So moving on to the phase 2, which was between 1969 to 1991, the major event that happened in banking structure in India is that nationalization of 14 major banks in the year 1969. So what is this nationalization called? All banks came under the control of government. Nationalization na government ownership kira banks vandiruchinu artham. So 14 major banks were basically nationalized in the year 1969. The second phase of nationalization happened in the year 1980. So the result is that during this phase, 80% of Indian banks were under government control. So this is the importance of phase 2. Moving on to the phase 3 from 1991 till date, what major changes happened in Indian banking system is that we had something called as Narasimhan Committee, which was formed in the year 1991, and they had some reform measures in Indian banking, which is basically liberalization of banking practices. So banking practices ella konjam restricted illama lenient vittanga, so liberalize pannitaanga, which means more banking practices strict illama lenient vittanga, so which resulted in many foreign banks being established. More ATMs were set up, phone banking, net banking, everything was introduced only during this phase. So these are the basic phases of development in Indian banking: phase 1, phase 2 and phase 3. Moving on to the next important question, which is classification of banks in India. In India, the banks were classified into 4 types: commercial banks, small finance banks, payment banks and cooperative bank. Under commercial banks, we have 4 types: public sector, private sector, foreign bank and regional rural bank. So what's commercial banks? Commercial banks are those banks that work for profit. Commercial banks were regulated under Banking Regulation Act 1949. And what is public sector banks? Any bank that is owned by government is called as public sector bank. Any bank owned by private parties are called private sector banks. Any bank that has its headquarters at foreign country, it's called foreign banks. And regional rural bank is such banks that work at regional level for the weaker section of the society. Moving on to the next classification, which is small finance bank. Small finance banks or small banks, they work for small business units. Small banks, they work for small scale industries, micro industries, farmers. So this is the basic characteristic feature of a small finance bank. Moving on to the next classification of banks, which is payment banks. So payment banks are a new model of banks. They accept deposits limited to 1 lakh per customer. So this is of recent origin, these payment banks, and the main feature of a payment bank is that it accepts deposit only limited to 1 lakh per customer. Moving on to the last classification of banks, which is cooperative banks. So cooperative banks are such banks which is registered under Cooperative Societies Act 1912. We already saw commercial banks, they are registered under Banking Regulation Act 1949, while cooperative banks were registered under Cooperative Societies Act 1912, and they work for no profit or no loss basis, while commercial banks, they work for profit basis. So with this, we have coming on to the conclusion of Unit 1. So hope you have understood the history of banking and the phase of development of Indian banking in India and the classification of Indian banks. Thank you.